Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Christopher Harding, and our topic is the Meiji Restoration, which transformed Japan in the 19th century. A little about Christopher before we start. He's a cultural historian and broadcaster based at the University of Edinburgh. He writes about Japan, India and East West Encounter, and is the author of the books Japan Story, The Japanese, and The Light of Asia. Christopher, welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, to get started, why is it called the Meiji Restoration and when did it take place?
So it took place in 1868, and it's called the Meiji Restoration because this was the point at which Japan shifted from being a country run by a shogun, these famous samurai governments, to being a country run once again by the emperor, who hadn't had an active role in Japanese politics for many centuries. And the reign name taken by the young emperor, who ended up at the top of Japanese politics after 1868, was Meiji, which means something like bright or enlightened rule.
Got it. So, then what did Japan look like in the decades leading up to the restoration?
So, Japan, those previous decades, it was really the end of a system that had once been really effective in Japan. So, really, since the early 1600s, Japan had been run by a samurai government. The shogun in Edo, which is now Tokyo, was in charge of the country. And then you had all these feudal domains around Japan, which pretty much did whatever they wanted to as long as they were basically loyal to the shogun. And then the samurai ran the country. Below them, you had farmers, craftspeople, and others who were considered really very much second class citizens, I think, compared to the samurai. So it's quite a strict authoritarian top down kind of rule, which had really worked for a while, partly because it proved to be an effective way of keeping foreigners out of Japan. The shoguns decided quite early on that they didn't want to have too much foreign interference. Back in the 16th century, they'd had Portuguese and Spanish there, missionaries and traders, caused too much trouble, and so they more or less shut their borders, dealt very carefully with the outside world. And I think a combination of that, not too much foreign interference, a very stable society, all these things together made Japan quite an affluent place, rich from trade, rich from its raw materials, an amazing cultural life. So across 17th and 18th centuries, listeners might have heard of things like kabuki, no drama. These things all made great strides in Japan. These beautiful woodblock prints as well. So generally quite a happy, settled place. But in the decades leading up to the Meiji Restoration, inside Japan, all that was starting to go wrong. What had once been a really good and stable system now didn't seem to be able to keep up with the economy changing fast in Japan, British, French, Americans, and others trying to have a kind of diplomatic or trading relationship with Japan. And a combination of pressures, I think, inside and outside, made it feel in Japan across those middle decades of the 19th century as though something had to give. The old system just wasn't really tenable anymore.
And why were the Western powers, particularly US, so interested in gaining access to Japan at the time?
So it's an interesting period, I think, for Japan. If you imagine this is the way Japanese school children grow up to see the world, a map of the world with Japan at the center, which is maybe unusual for British or American listeners, but you can probably readily imagine it. Over on the left-hand side to the west of Japan, you've got Asia, you've got, of course, the Russian Empire in this period. And on the other side, across the Pacific, of course, you've got the United States. In the middle of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was spreading its influence and its interests eastwards, so towards Japan. And of course, the US was doing the same thing with California, expansion of the country towards its Pacific seaboard. And so both Russia and the United States start to look and see into the Pacific who's there, who's going to be of interest. China, people are already trading with China. European colonial powers treating it famously quite badly. But it's really the United States in particular and the interest that it takes in Japan that I think changes things. So in this period, by the time you get to the 1850s, you can get from California to Japan in about 18 days by steamship. So that's almost a next door neighbor sort of relationship right there. And what the US wanted, at least at the beginning, was permission for American ships, if they're out whaling in that part of the world and they get into trouble, they can resupply or be rescued by the Japanese. Whereas the Japanese have had, up until that point, a policy where if a foreign ship gets anywhere near Japan, you can fire on it, you can push it away from your shores. So the US, by the 1850s, they really want to change that and have at least a basic relationship with Japan.
And what was Japan's relationship with neighboring Asian countries at this point?
It had historically quite strong relationships with China and Korea. So one thing that Japanese sometimes find a bit disappointing is the number of things in Japan, whether it's sort of food or architecture or philosophy, that originally come from China or Korea, and that the Japanese have sort of taken and done something with. That can be quite dispiriting, the amount of their culture that really has origins elsewhere. So historically a very close relationship. In the early modern periods, so 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries, under the Japanese shoguns about whom we've just been talking, Japan has limited trading relationships with countries like China and Korea and with Southeast Asia. They try as far as possible to have that trade come in just through the port of Nagasaki. And also, they'll only deal from all the European and Western countries, they'll only deal with the Dutch. And they are also dealing with the Dutch just from Nagasaki. So it's a real sense of border control in Japan at this point.
In terms of then Japan itself, so you were saying in the decades leading up to this point in time, things were less stable than prior.
Mm.
So, what internal political pressures or just general pressures and divisions existed within Japan at the time that may have contributed to the events?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of things I think worth mentioning. The shogunate, so the Tokugawa dynasty of shoguns, controlling Japan since the early 1600s, they got into that position because they won this huge battle in 1600 at a place called Sekigahara. And ever since 1600, the feudal lords who were on the losing side of that were biding their time. They were waiting for something to go wrong for the shogunate to take their chance to take back Japan from them if they possibly could. So there are stories in the southwest of Japan where quite a few of the feudal domains who had lost that war were based, that mothers would sometimes put their children to bed with their feet facing Edo as a kind of rebuke, right, to the shogunate in Edo. Or at New Year, some of them would have a ritual where they would say, "Is it time for us to go and remove the Tokugawa shogunate?" And the ritual reply would be, "No, the time is not yet." But there was this strong memory kept alive that the shogunate at some point would need to be removed, overturned. So I think that's been there all the time. Second thing that goes on is that the samurai class, who are right at the top of Japanese society, they're about 6% of the population. They've long moved from warrior work to office work, right? There isn't really much war to be had in Japan. It's a very peaceful and stable place. So they're doing all this office work. They're being paid a kind of stipend for that. And as the Japanese economy starts to change, although the samurai are right at the top, the actual real value of their income goes down. And so some of them are living really quite precarious lives. There are stories of samurai selling their daughters in marriage to people, or selling off the family armor or swords to try and make ends meet. And at the same time, merchants, traders who are more or less at the bottom of Japan's social system, because they're considered to be people who sort of deal in the produce of other people rather than do anything creative and useful themselves. Technically at the bottom, but in fact, they're some of the richest people in Japan. These enormous mansions, swaggering around in silk, having an amazing life. And so there's a sense in Japan that there's an enormous mismatch between the way society runs in theory and who's got power in reality. And the Tokugawa shoguns constantly trying things to see if they can reorder the economy, reorder society, but they seem to be failing. And there are these rebellions, there are famines. So there's a sense in Japan internally by the mid 19th century that something isn't right.
And was there an emperor at the time?
Yes, so Japan has had an emperor for, estimates vary, but at least 1500 years, unbroken. It's astonishing. The family now who were there in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo are the same bloodline as the emperor and empresses 1500 years ago. So they've always been there, but they haven't really, since about the year 1200, any political power. For most part, they've been resident in Kyoto. Their job is to perform rituals associated with Shinto, so the indigenous religion of Japan. Maybe they get involved in writing poetry, these sorts of refined kind of courtly entertainments and duties, as opposed to having any real role in politics. So they're there, they're in Kyoto, and importantly, they're there as a potential figurehead, right? If you're an insurgent in Japan and you maybe want to get rid of the shogunate, taking the emperor as your figurehead would, in theory, be a really smart idea because that's instant legitimacy. So they're there in Kyoto, as it were, waiting to be used.
Just to make sure, to understand the point, why does it create instant legitimacy?
I think because although most Japanese in the 19th century wouldn't have known very much about their imperial family, so it's a world away from, say, the way the British imperial family interacts with the media now. They won't have known very much about them at all, but they will know that it's an unbroken line for many centuries, and that the claim the emperor and the empresses make for themselves is that they are descended from the gods. So whether you literally believe that that happened or not, and some people do and some people don't, the sense that they are at the absolute heart of what it means to be Japanese is extremely important. And the only reason that's at least given out why the imperial family aren't active in politics is because they're considered to be so rarefied and important that you wouldn't want to bother them with this sort of murky, filthy everyday world of politics. They're considered to be above it. So I think for those sorts of reasons, people have a strong sense of the mystique and the deep legitimacy of the imperial family.
So then, how serious was the military threat or just threat posed by the US and other Western powers?
So one thing that sometimes confuses us historians about this period is, Japan being an island nation, it didn't have a navy, which sounds kind of strange until you realize that once they had decided they were going to have very little to do with the outside world, except for managing these trading relationships via Nagasaki, there wasn't really enormous cause for having a powerful navy. They had basic ships that would do a bit of trade around the coastline, but no real navy. And when someone did make the rather obvious point, being an island nation, should we develop a navy? The response of the shoguns was to say, it's not for you to think about our security policy. And the poor guy who wrote that book, all his books were burned, the wood blocks that they were printed on were smashed, and he was put under house arrest. So to try and suggest how the shogunate ought to run their affairs was a really controversial thing to do. So they didn't have a navy. What they also didn't have is up-to-date weapons technology. So we think some of the firearms that samurai were holding and using in a ritual way rather than really firing in the mid-19th century would, if you were in the US or Britain, they'd be in an attic or in a museum. They're 200 years old. Most of them probably didn't work. They probably didn't have much ammunition for them either. So if you think about all those things together, Japan was in a relatively weak position should a technologically advanced power insist on forging some kind of a relationship with Japan. And so what you see in the 1850s, I think particularly with the United States, very famously in 1853, Commodore Matthew C. Perry is sent by President Fillmore to go all the way to Japan and to ask for basic relationship between the Japan and the US, so that American sailors who get into trouble can be looked after, American ships can refuel, these sorts of things. And he arrives in the summer of 1853, and Perry, I think, is quite smart about what he does. So he reads up about Japan in New York City Public Library before he goes, and the impression he gets is that the Japanese will respond to a show of force. They respect how you act and what you do more than being interested in what you say. So the Western world isn't hugely well informed about Japan, but I think it's more or less right on that point. And so he sails these black hulled steamships, heavily armed, to the coast of Japan, not far from Edo, which is now Tokyo, lands some of his Marines on the beach. He chooses the Marines who are the biggest and the tallest to come with him. He takes two military bands onto the beach, not one, but two, has them play Hail Columbia, shows off his weapons, and basically says, look at the size of these ships. The Japanese have never seen ships of the size that Perry brings. And he says, not only have I got these ships, out in the Pacific, I've got more. Back home off the coast of California, I've got even more. And he says, I'll give you a year to think about what I've asked or what my president has asked for. And then I'm going to come back for your answer. And he gives them a piece of white cloth, either a handkerchief or a piece of white cloth. And he says, look, have that. If I come back in a year and your answer is no, there's going to be a conflict, which you will certainly lose. And you can use that when you feel like surrendering. So it's a classic bit of gunboat diplomacy. And the Japanese immediately realize the technological gap that exists. Japan doesn't have steamship technology. It doesn't have a cannon that big and powerful. It doesn't have artillery. It doesn't have a lot of the stuff that clearly Perry possesses. So the Japanese immediately realize they're potentially in an awful lot of trouble here.
Wow. So then what happens next?
So Perry goes away as he promises, then he comes back. And in the meantime, these few months that elapse while Perry is gone, there's a kind of panic in the shogunate. They don't know what to do. They negotiate a little bit with the emperor in Kyoto. They also send letters out to other powerful feudal lords around Japan to say, guys, what do you think? Here's the challenge. What do you reckon? And for some people, in retrospect, that seems like a really big mistake. If your job, the word shogun, it'll be familiar to people, but the longer form is Taisei shogun in Japanese, which means barbarian crushing generalissimo. So in kind of, contemporary parlance, you had one job as the shogunate, which is to keep the barbarians away from Japan. And yet here they are, clearly our superior in all sorts of ways that really matter. So the shogunate starts to look really weak in the face of these feudal lords, and looks weak to the emperor in Kyoto as well. So already things are looking a bit rocky for the shogunate. In the end, the decision people come to is they say, at the very least, we clearly need the weapons that the Americans have. So if we want that weaponry, we need to have a basic relationship, a little bit of trade, a little bit of kind of swapping of technological and industrial ideas so that we can defend ourselves as we must. So by the time Perry comes back, it's decided that he'll have basically what he wants. So that's 1854. That basic relationship is forged. But what really happens after that, just for a few years after that, what's really important is while the shogunate is struggling at home with its legitimacy, the Americans are back asking for more. Then the British and the French and the Dutch and the Russians, whatever treaty a rival Western power gets with Japan, all the other big Western powers want the same. So within a few years of Perry arriving, Japan has conceded actually quite a lot. It's conceded lots of trade deals, which are quite poor in terms of the Japanese side of it. They come off quite badly. There are places like Yokohama, which people have heard of, only a tiny village at this point. They're opened up as these treaty ports where foreign traders can come and live. They can do their trade. If they commit a crime, they'll be tried according to their country's laws rather than Japan's. So there's a sense for Japanese critics of this new relationship with the West that's starting to emerge that the shogun has completely lost control of Japan's borders because people are coming in, dodgy trade deals. These foreigners are often behaving quite badly. There's a famous woodblock print of a sumo wrestler throwing this kind of overdressed foreigner over his knee onto the floor, which gives you a sense of how some in Japan were feeling. And there are members of the British delegation who get attacked by samurai and sort of cut up because people just want to push them out. So some of that anger in Japan is directed against foreigners, but a lot of it is directed against the shogunate for having let this happen. And I think that's where you get the seeds of the Meiji Restoration.
So there's this period of heightened turmoil that's happening through the 50s and then into the 60s. What kicks off the restoration then?
That's right. Yes. So Japan already being weak internally in the way we said, and then the arrival of these foreigners and the turmoil they create, there start to be important feudal lords around Japan who begin to think to themselves, how can we play this situation to our advantage? There are also, really importantly, younger samurai. So I often tell my students, my students are in their 20s, a lot of them. So younger samurai, kind of their age, these maybe early 30s, who look at what's going on and they say, you know what, the shogunate and also the higher echelons of each domain around Japan, they're run by old men who have let us down. They are politically naive. They're not brave enough to stand up to the West. We really need to take things into our own hands. So you start to get what historians call young men of high purpose, shishi, who will training school to use samurai swords better. They will leave their home domains and go to places like Kyoto, where there is a big sort of political ferment, and they'll start to take things into their own hands. So you get more and more violence on the street in Japan once you get into the early 1860s. And by the time you get to the mid 1860s, a couple of domains in the southwest of Japan, Satsuma and Choshu, who historically hated the shogunate, they were some of the losers way back in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. Young samurai get control of those domains in the end. And they become powerful enough. They equip their militaries with modern weapons bit by bit over these tumultuous years, so that by 1866, 1867, they're pretty much ready to challenge the shogunate. And then the Europeans start to take sides. The British throw in their lot with these kind of rebels. The French throw in their lot with the shogunate. So the French are arming the shogunate. They're giving them uniforms. They're lending them money. They're giving them military training and saying, look, if the shogunate can survive, France has made a really good friend here. But in the end, a civil war begins. The rebels, mainly from the southwest, pretty much physically take hold of the young emperor, who's only a teenager at the time, sort of 16, 17 years of age. But they take hold of him, have him as his figurehead, have him as their figurehead, start to call themselves the Imperial Army and go under that banner. And Japan ends up in a brief but really important civil war from 1868 to 1869, where if people think about that kind of crescent-shaped archipelago of Japan, you've got the rebel forces who begin more or less in the southwest, and then they chase the shogunate's forces all the way up round the archipelago, up Japan's main island of Honshu, and across to what is now Hokkaido, where the shogunate creates a republic, a beautifully romantic and completely impractical idea right at the end, creates a republic. But then the rebel forces get there, so-called Imperial Army, get there, completely destroy them. And the Meiji Restoration has happened. The country is now in their hands.
And how does the country change once the restoration has now taken place?
I think this is what's remarkable, actually. So people call it a restoration, as we've been calling it, because it's a restoration of imperial rule. In fact, the emperor's a kind of figurehead, pretty much a puppet. And these young samurai who get into Edo, it gets called Tokyo instead, which means Eastern capital. It becomes Japan's real capital now. They instigate an extraordinary national overhaul. So I think their basic logic is in 1868, Japan is very weak. China, just across the water, traditionally Japan's cultural big brother, right? All these extraordinary inventions have come from China. China is seen as being the greatest empire on earth, and yet it's being picked apart by Europeans because of their superior technology. And because the Chinese had taken the attitude for quite a long time towards Westerners, you're barbarians, we're better than you, we don't need your stuff, we don't need to trade with you. Clearly, that approach has badly backfired for China. So these young Japanese leaders take a completely different view. They say we will open up to trade. They have a whole load of them. Actually, some of the most important leaders in the early 1870s go on a round the world trip, including to various parts of the US, Europe, and Asia, to see what they can learn from each country in terms of government, in terms of military, in terms of industry, in terms of politics, all these sorts of things. They make that round the world trip so they can basically hoover up all the best ideas for modernizing the country as quickly as possible. There's some lovely stories actually when they do this. Some of them they get to the US and they think, well, hang on, this guy George Washington, clearly very important. So why isn't the family of George Washington still in charge of the US? Why do you have this ignominious system where the leader of such a great country has to go and beg the population for his job back every 4 years. It seems completely ridiculous to them. So they've got to learn how these Western systems work, and they more or less choose democracy in the end. But what's extraordinary is the rapidity with which they do this, right? They have a brand new tax system. They get their postal system mainly from Britain, police force, much of the army from France. And then when the French lose a war to Germany, they say, okay, maybe Germany or Prussia should be our source for the military. They take all these ideas, they innovate, they improve upon them. And really, across the lifetime of the Meiji Emperor, he passes away in 1912, Japan rises from being a really weak player in Asia to being an industrial power, quite a strong economy, Asia's greatest military force by a long way. We'll maybe come back to this, but they famously beat Russia in a war, 1904 to 5, which at the time is an extraordinary achievement. In the racialized rhetoric of the era, for a yellow power to beat a Western white one is a really, really big shock. So it's extraordinarily effective. It has its downsides, and we'll talk about those, I'm sure. But the sheer rapidity with which life changes in Japan, especially if you're a resident of a city, it's dizzying. It really is.
So they changed the institutions. How do they change the culture? How does society itself change? Or how do they drive that change in society?
Yes, that's a really important question, a really important consideration for them, actually, at the time. Having the emperor as their figurehead helped, because some of these guys who end up basically in charge of Japan, they sometimes get called founding fathers, actually, slightly modeled on the US. No one knows who they are. They're absolute nobodies. So having the emperor as their figurehead really helps. They have a monopoly on violence, to put it crudely. Having won that civil war, what they then do is they then form a conscript army. They don't want anymore to have the samurai as the backbone of their armed forces, because they have quite a low view of the samurai as being more likely in battle, each individual, to think about his own family honor than to do what he's told by his commander. And you can't really have effective modern warfare, they realize, if you've got a kind of every man for himself, glorious battle dreams. It has to be well trained people who will do what they're told. So samurai status is abolished. It's an ordinary conscript army. And if people want to get a sense of the romance of that, I actually really liked The Last Samurai, the Tom Cruise film, which is really, about this period and the loss of the samurai and the pathos of that moment. I think there's something in there. You've got a conscript who all he has to do is turn a cogwheel to work a Gatling gun, and he can take down samurai who may have had their whole lives practicing with sword and bow and arrow. So, there is something in that, I think. So they managed to do that. The monopoly on violence, they've got the emperor as their figurehead. They're very good also at schooling. So by the end of the 1800s, by the year 1900, every child is required, girls and boys, to go through a few years of primary school education. And the authorities go large on ethics. So some academics, they study these ethics textbooks and they look at this really interesting mix of old style Confucian values, loyalty to father and mother, respect for teachers, respect for elders, of course, ultimate loyalty to the emperor. The mixture of that with actually quite modern values about giving your life for the nation if you're required to do so. And just to give you one quick insight into that, just to finish off this little bit, they have an imperial rescript on education, this document, which is all about how everyone in Japan should show filial piety towards the emperor. That document, alongside a portrait of the emperor, is there in every school. And there's a rule: if the school is in trouble, if a fire breaks out, lots of Japanese buildings are still wood and paper at this point, you must absolutely save the imperial rescript and the portrait. And there are stories of schools burning down and someone failing to do that, and they'll take their own lives in recompense for having failed to do it. So there's a really powerful and effective effort to shape young minds. And the moment people always talk about that seems to reflect how well that's gone, the education, plus, of course, newspapers, largely owned by some of these important leaders, they play their part. The big moment, July 1912, when the emperor has died and the news has gone round, you can see photographs of Japanese people on their knees outside the imperial palace in Tokyo, just weeping. And this is a country where people had no idea who their emperor was until just a few decades ago. But now they feel they've got this really deep personal connection. So it just shows you, I think, how effective all this really was.
So then, um, how did the Restoration shape Japan for the 20th century?
Yeah. I think looking back on it, one thing people would say about the long term effects of the Meiji era is that, yes, Japan modernized in all sorts of ways in terms of technology, industry, all those sorts of institutional areas of life very successfully. There is a question mark over how fully the country embraced democracy and the idea that the real idea of rule by the people. So what's really interesting is during the Second World War, when the United States realizes that the war is going to end with an occupation, an Allied occupation of Japan, which, given all that the US has suffered and has ploughed into that war, the US should lead. Given that, they get historians of Japan and political commentators on Japan almost around a table to say, what's your reading of how Japan ended up in the position where it launched this series of wars in Asia and the Pacific? How did that happen? And how do we change Japan when we have our chance as an occupying power? And one of the things they say, and I don't think they were actually far off the mark, is that what we might call a feudal mentality somehow managed to survive even while Japan modernized in all these other ways. Because it wasn't really in the interests of the political leaders to give democracy full reign. Some of those early political leaders in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s were basically saying this project of modernizing Japan is far too precious to put it to a vote every few years. So although Japan did have democracy, kind of a small franchise, the actual power of its parliament, or diet as they called it, was always kept very limited, and real power remained in the hands of a very small clique. That's the way they wanted it. And I think that became a problem in the 90s and the 1930s, where the military started to take more and more of a role in politics and in the leadership of Japan. There wasn't a really well developed sense of democracy and of civil society and of grassroots political parties that might have challenged that dark turn of events. So I'd say mostly the Meiji legacy is a positive one, but in that sense, I think it's quite dark.
So maybe on a similar point then, in those years that followed, did Japan look back and on the restoration with regret or nostalgia or critique? What was that perspective?
Mm. Um, it shows you there's nothing new under the sun, because we have in the UK, I'm sure you have it in the US, that it happens a lot in Japan now, which is criticizing the younger generation. I get mixed up with who is Gen Z and who's Gen whatever, but that sense that the younger generation just aren't cut out for kind of real life, or they're kind of self-absorbed, etc. There was a real trend in social criticism in Japan in the years after the Meiji Restoration, so the late 1910s, early 1920s, saying that the younger generation, all they want to do is either make money for themselves, buy American fashions, go and see French films, or basically write bad poetry. And they would say, the parents' generation would say, look, we sweated blood to build this country. Look at our achievements, back in the Meiji era. This was a kind of golden age for nation building in Japan. And everything that came after, people ask a lot of questions about. There's a lot of soul searching. And it's not just down to the younger generation wanting something different, or wanting to enjoy the fruits of a more affluent society. It's partly that. But I think it's also partly a question that Japan never really solved. And I wonder whether it's solved it now, which is, what's the difference between modernizing and westernizing? So the Japanese in the Meiji era and after were really concerned about this. We want to modernize in the sense that we need weapons of the sort that Commodore Perry turned up with and the British have clearly got. We want that. We want industry. We want railways, etc. And all those things. How do we do that though without westernizing? And a lot of these technologies turn out to have social implications. And so there was always a difficulty in Japan of trying to keep those two things distinct and say, how do we basically avoid becoming a mere facsimile of Great Britain? Some people would, they'd imagine the great Eurasian continent. Britain is an island nation at one end, Japan is an island nation at the other. The Japanese didn't want simply to become an East Asian Great Britain? And the answer to that question that some people start to have in Japan, which starts out as being romantic and ends up being quite dark, is that Westerners are fundamentally individualistic in kind of a selfish way. In the end, they're looking out for themselves. And one Japanese philosopher said, look, go to the UK or the US and look at how a house is built with brick walls partitioning each room, each room in the house. That will really show you that a so-called family in the West is a kind of cohabitation arrangement, really for the benefit of each individual. And they really want to be shut off from each other. Go to a Japanese home where these screens of wood and paper can be opened or closed to either give you a bit of privacy if they're closed or be opened up so you all feel like you're together and the family is flowing as one. That shows you a Japanese mentality where it's society first, the collective good first. And, it's obviously a very romanticized notion. There's a certain amount of truth in it because of the legacy, I think, of Confucianism in Japan. But nevertheless, you start to get this kind of polarized discussion where the Japanese are selfless, they're close to nature, they have poetic souls, etc. Great Britain, the US, France, etc. are, individualistic, capitalistic. Their societies are premised on competition and division. And once that dichotomy sort of really takes root, it becomes easy for military leaders, and some of them do go on these lecture tours in Japan in the 20s and the 1930s, and say to them, if we want to protect Japan, we have to live by these values, and you need the military to act as a guarantor of those values. So I think that turn in Japan, again, after the Meiji era, 1910s, 20s, really becomes powerful by the end of the 1920s, is disastrous for Japan. But for whatever reason, there is no, I suppose it comes back to that civil society point in part, at least. And then, the Japanese people, as well as Americans after the war, had the same critique that there just weren't enough people who would stand up and say, the military is now too much involved in our politics. We need to push back. Or we need grassroots political parties that can put pressure on our leaders. None of that. And instead, movements that might have furnished that, like trade unions, etc., are stamped out in Japan across the course of the 1920s. And so there's very little that can really push back against these dark turns that I've been talking about.
Well, so when you say disastrous, what are you referring to?
I think a couple of things. By the late 1920s and the early 90s, although Japan is a big military power in the world, there is still a sense that the so-called global order, which is now guaranteed by the League of Nations after the First World War, is really a case of the decks being stacked against Japan. So the Japanese try and have a racial equality clause put in to the covenant of the League of Nations. That gets refused, partly because of countries like Australia that worry about massive immigration from places like Japan. So there's a sense there, I think, in Japan, once that gets refused, that, all this grand talk of international sort of peace and brotherhood is really for the birds, because the British still have their empire. The French have their empire. The US is a very powerful country, clearly operating in accordance with its own interests. You also then have the Soviet Union, about which the Japanese worry very much. And in China, you have the rise of the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. So all these things are happening in the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. So those foreign policy changes, alongside the sense within Japan that their politics is too westernized, Japan has become too capitalistic, and that you need more involvement for the military in everyday politics as a sort of guarantor of values. When these things start to come together, you start to see a rhetoric in Japan that, in order to guarantee its security, Japan has to strike first. So by the time you get to the early 1930s, Japan already has a small empire. It has Korea, it has Taiwan, it has a small foothold on mainland Asia, in parts of Manchuria. But then in the early 90s, it takes over Manchuria completely. It starts to be sold to people in Japan that we have to do these things because otherwise the Soviet Union will dominate this part of the world, or the Chinese will, or the US will try and dominate us via the Pacific. So it's become, they would say, existential for Japan, that kind of rhetoric. And so although from a Western point of view, we see that conflict as being simply an aggressive Japan trying to take ever more territory. And I think that's true. That's not an unfair way of reading it. But the way it's successfully sold to people back in Japan is that Japan is this civilized outpost in Asia being squeezed by these big hypocritical Western powers. And in order to survive and maintain its values, it has to strike first, whether that's Manchuria, later on mainland China, and later on, of course, Pearl Harbor. So it's the way that that combination of circumstances comes together and makes it possible for the military in Japan to sell it to ordinary Japanese people, which I think is at least partly an outgrowth of the Meiji period.
So, circling back to the Meiji period,
Mm.
was this a conversation that began pretty much right away, or I'll state it as an assumption that it was glossed over because Japan was stabilizing due to the changes?
So, do you want to ask me that one more time? What was that question?
Of course. So, in terms of pre-restoration,
Yeah.
things are, using my words, they're chaotic or unstable. There's conflict. There's tensions. Various groups are fighting within against one another. Then the restoration happens, and all of these changes come into place.
Mm.
Is there a vocal "this is not best for Japan" conversation taking place? Or is it that because, and this is the assumption part, that things have now stabilized, there's maybe unity, a lot of this tension, conflict is now removed from society, that these conversations don't really surface because Japan is experiencing stability after a period of instability?
I see what you mean. Yeah, I think we often talk, when we think about the Meiji period, we often talk about winners and losers. So we talked about the last the last samurai film earlier on. We'll give it one more plug. I suppose one of the big messages from that film, and it's true to the historical reality, is that a lot of the young samurai who helped instigate the Meiji Restoration never expected that, as it were, they would be the turkeys voting for Christmas. That within a few short years, their privileges would be gone, and some of these samurai struggle to make it in the world of business. There's a kind of a running joke in some of the newspapers about so-called bushi shoho, which is warrior business management. Some of these guys, they set up things like restaurants in Tokyo, and they do it so badly. Some of them think, look, I'm only feeding commoners, so it doesn't matter if my beef is, a few days past its best, I'll serve it to them anyway. And, then people get food poisoning, etc. Some of these samurai turn out to be not cut out for life in a modernizing Japan. And so they very much feel as though the older Japan, or aspects of the older Japan which should have been kept, have been prematurely jettisoned. I suppose they saw themselves as serving in a Japanese armed forces where you would have the samurai, but they would have ultra modern weaponry. That was what they were hoping for. Instead, conscripts take over, samurai have no more status, and some of these guys go bankrupt quite quickly. So they're clearly losers. I think another group in society who would regard themselves and who protest actually across the course of the Meiji period, because although it's a fairly authoritarian system of government, you do get protests, whether it's via literature or kind of out on the streets, are women, and particularly middle class women. So there is a view, actually based on the ideal American housewife of the late 19th century, that your ideal Japanese housewife should be smart enough at least to put the books back up on the bookshelf the right way up when she's finished dusting. So enough education for that, enough education that she doesn't bore her husband to tears over the dinner table, and so that she doesn't embarrass him in company. But beyond that, the role of the woman, there's a slogan, good wife, wise mother. The role of the woman is to bring up the children well, both in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of their values, to be a real educator in Japanese values at home. And so a lot of Japanese women, they become first wave of Japanese feminism, really. They say, actually, women are capable of a lot more. We want to be nurses, teachers, doctors. We want to go to university. We want to be writers, all these sorts of things. Clearly, this ideal Meiji era housewife is no good for us. And we want to push back on that ideal, and we want to achieve something else. So they would see themselves, I think, as getting the raw end of it. I suppose the very last group I might mention would be parts of the industrial and rural poor. So the rural poor in Japan start to see themselves as being really used as the rice producers to funnel rice into the cities, whereas they see it, middle class urban types are living the high life off their backs, basically. There's a really interesting moment. In 1923, Japan suffers a terrible earthquake that affects Tokyo and Yokohama. And one of the diaries that's been discovered by a rural Japanese man from this period says that earthquake was basically God's punishment for urbanites living these corrupt lives off the backs of the rural poor. So there's a real sense of resentment there. And it's the same thing also with the industrial workforce, especially if you have skills that are quite easy to pick up, so you can be easily fired. Because the Meiji Restoration, because their leaders are prioritizing economic growth and stability, their sympathies really lie with the managers of factories and entrepreneurs, people who are prepared to risk a bit to build an industrial base. So you're not going to get terribly much sympathy from your political leaders if your conditions of work are not very good or if you're not being paid very much. So there's quite a lot of suffering there. So I think in those areas of life, there is quite a lot of discontent and protest. And it's really these authoritarian structures that manage to push things through and keep those voices marginalized.
I guess now, looking back with the historian's lens, what are some lessons or a lesson to take away from the Meiji Restoration?
I think if you're the kind of person whose politics lends itself to strong leadership, which is not everybody's cup of tea, the Meiji Restoration can be looked on as an example of a radical national overhaul which was forced through by a handful of strong leaders against the protests of quite a few people because they considered themselves to be far-sighted and have the nation's best interests at heart. And that if you put, as it were, every one of their measures to the vote, plenty of people would have wanted to vote it down, which is why they were prepared to squash democracy up to a point anyway and get on with it themselves. So a big lesson I think people might draw now, if you're of that kind of political philosophy that a strong and purposeful national leadership gets things done, the Meiji Restoration I think is quite a good example of that. But I suppose then I'd want to put the flip side of it, which is thinking back to those critiques after the Second World War that people made, not just in the West, but as I was saying, Japanese political scientists and historians and others were saying the same thing. If you end up with a society where people feel that they cannot express their opinions openly and honestly, and where there isn't robust debate, where there isn't civil society and people having a sense that they individually have a stake in their country and in how it's being run, then you are at the mercy of certain institutions coming in and riding roughshod over your constitution. And I think the military is a case in point for Japan. And I think you might compare it only in some ways to perhaps a country like Myanmar or Pakistan, where the military remains very powerful and to some extent has this image of itself as being the guardians of the population politically and maybe even morally to some extent. I think that's true to a limited extent in the Pakistani military. There are cautionary aspects, I think, to the history of the Meiji Restoration that we should probably bear in mind.
Fascinating. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think we should talk about in regards to the Meiji Restoration?
I wonder. One last thing I might say about it is I often find it interesting because I'm quite a frequent visitor to Japan. My wife is Japanese. We're bringing up our children actually with a bit of Japanese culture. So for all those reasons, I access Japanese media quite a lot, whether it's stories or TV dramas or anime, etc. I always find it interesting that the period before the Meiji Restoration is remembered with great warmth and nostalgia. The period where the shogunate was in charge, where there were no complications dealing with foreign powers, being a kind of global player yourself. None of those things were on the minds of people in Japan. They were, as these bits of media would have you believe anyway, living simple lives, not much war, enjoying a bit of literature, a bit of theatre, etc. Huge nostalgia for that period. It's really interesting if you then look at the way the Meiji Restoration and later periods are covered, it becomes much, much more mixed in the Japanese media. There have been some positive portrayals of the Meiji Restoration, but it's often portrayed as a kind of morality play where plucky Japan is struggling to hold on to its values against this onslaught, this confusion, this kind of chaos of competing foreign, largely Western ideas about what it means to be a human being, what's a good society, what kind of politics ought we to have. And so Japan's view of its own history starts to become more mixed and more murky from the Meiji Restoration onwards, I think. So the way you see it being processed in Japan, I think, really tells you that this was an exciting and dynamic, but actually quite difficult period. And there are some in Japan, I think, who would still tell you that it wasn't handled as well as it might have been. That if it had been handled differently, Japan might not have gone through the struggles and inflicted the struggles on other people that it did in the middle of the 20th century.
Christopher, thank you so much for sharing. This is a absolutely fascinating conversation. So really, really appreciate the discussion.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me on. Cheers.